Hello, welcome everyone to our Navigate Billing Compliance and the Importance of Supporting Documentation. With you today are our hosts, myself, Ashley Haskins, I am the Senior Operations Manager at Bill Max, and my colleague Megan Linden, the Director of Operations for Bill Max as well. Megan, would you like to go ahead and give our audience a quick little hello?
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. If you've joined us before, if this is your first time, welcome.
Yes, we're excited to see some of you guys for the first time, or maybe you've listened to a couple of us before on other webinars. But if you're brand new to today, a couple of quick things and gentle reminders from a housekeeping perspective. We do try to keep the clutter down and the noise, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to identify questions. We'll get to them throughout the webinar or at the end here as well. But our comments are turned off in order to allow us to make this transition nice and smooth and for you guys to enjoy the presentation today. A little reminder, we also have a recording that'll be sent to you in a follow-up email. So please don't hurt your hands. Don't try to rapidly take notes. This is all something that if you can stay engaged with us, would be helpful and a beneficial presentation for you all as well. And we'll send that copy of video here in roughly 2 to 3 days afterwards. So this is our agenda for today, kind of covers all three of those pain points that this audience is telling us is something you guys are relatively feeling the same kind of stress points. So we're going to talk about what is understanding billing and its compliance and all those pieces. What do we kind of look at from a fundamental view? How do we unpack it? How do we look at the supporting documentation related to compliance? How do we look at the payer's perspective and what views they prioritize over us as providers? How do we look at identifying it? So where do we really start? Where do we begin with certain pieces of compliance? How do we enhance documentation processes? And then finally, the adherence to the internal piece. So how do we kind of tie all that in and bring it in home with our own personal workflows and pieces? So Megan, before we get into the next slide here, do you mind chiming in and talking to the curious audience members that we have today a little bit about the importance of the paperwork side of it? So supporting documentation.
Sure, of course. I'd love to jump in here. We like to say that there's 3 W's of supporting documentation. The first thing that comes to mind when you think of compliant billing information, as we've gone over in many compliant billing practices webinars before, is what's really on the claim form. But compliant billing isn't just reliant on what is exactly on that claim form. There's other pieces behind what compliant billing is. So let's start off with the why. Supporting documentation is the evidence or the proof that you provided the services listed on that claim form. It gives you all of the details for the sessions, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. If you honestly break down a claim form, all of these details are listed somewhere on that claim. Who? Is it the client information? Is it the provider information? The what? The service type, the where, the place of service, when, the dates of service, and in some claim forms, the times, the why, the diagnosis code, why you're rendering the services. If you cannot support the information that is on that claim form with your supporting documentation, it's lacking the basic information to support the services rendered. If you're not supporting that, you are not following all billing compliance guidelines. In the world today, we understand that there's always a why to something. Our supporting documentation gives us a more detailed why the services are being rendered to help support the ongoing need for that service. Without this documentation, proper payment for services may be delayed until proper documentation is provided. Service details could be denied, and it could start putting an audit, which delays payments further. What is considered supporting documentation? Session notes, treatment plans, formal diagnoses. All forms of supporting documentation. The types of documentation and what is needed on those documentations are all part of your billing compliance. Now we need to remember that each payer is different and what they require can be different and can change. Best practice is to look at the requirements for all of your contracted provider, select the one that has the most strict guidelines, and develop a template based off of those strict guidelines. This always helps ensure providers have a standard and that all the information, even if a payer has a less requirement, that it's all supported. And please note that most federal and state guidelines are the most strict, where your commercial payers tend to be a little bit more lenient when it comes to the supporting documentation. Who is responsible for the supporting documentation? Actually, the entire organization is responsible for compliant billing practices, including supporting documentation. It starts with the admin team by understanding what is needed, followed by the providers following those requirements, and finished by your RCM team knowing where to find those documents, what to look for a bill, and how to get those documentations over to a payer if needed for audit or medical necessity purposes. Now, Ashley, if I can hand it back to you so you can elaborate more on how these all tie together at the payer level.
Oh, absolutely. So we're going to kind of chime into what is actual compliance at that payer level. And some of you guys in this group may be asking yourself, I don't really know where to identify what compliant means. Is it really just a bunch of stuff put on complicated contracts just to confuse the consumer? It feels that way sometimes. However, billing compliance is following applicable federal and state regulation policies that dictate proper billing services rendered. So these regulations are often evaluated with some form of clinical integrity and data supported by their application rules as well. However, because not all payers are governed by some regulating body, the challenge really begins on knowing their unique differences. So for every organization, you have your own set of responsibilities to ensure that the guidelines are being followed, like Megan, you said a second ago. This includes not just the information provided on a claim form, but all appropriate clinical and medical necessity documentation. So from a federal governing policy, they're pretty much deciphered by being federally government funded. So they have very strict guidelines, like you said earlier, Megan, and these regulations typically are correlated by their funding source. So published regulations, changes, amendments are all made visible to the public eye. It's not buried deep in some contract that you signed maybe 5-6 years ago. It's not in a URL that's tagged to another URL on a website somewhere. Federal payers have to regulate this information publicly, so it should be rather easy to locate. State guidelines are also governing policies that are paid for by the state, in which services are rendered in a similar fashion as your Medicaid policies. You may see these as state Medicaids, or maybe your commercials have a Medicaid line, which we refer to as MCOs. But these also are governing factions that follow state regulations, federal guidelines. So they're looking at things like certification levels, licensing, clinic functions, etc. And all these things are based off of your specific state. So if you operate in multiple states with the same payer, your regulations could be different publications for those regional areas. So make sure you're paying attention to those state governed guidelines. However, for both federal and state guidelines, it's valuable to check these resources often, as the state tells you or kind of slips in there that you're responsible for maintaining these guidelines and staying up to date. And from what we've seen, Megan, federal payers usually release amendments at least once a year, if not more, maybe twice a year, things like that. So you should have it somewhere in your timeline to do the same checking and balancing processes internally. For payers that are governed by a different entity, so for example, provided by an individual payer, maybe you're applying services within clients in a network status, these guidelines can be found in maybe more of a provider manual or through a network representative. And when I say by payer, I mean like your network in, network out status, but you're pretty much working with a commercial payer, not a state or a federally funded payer. So these guidelines tend to get a little trickier to find because they're usually provided to you upon agreement to work with the payer. So if you're in network, you're relying on a contract agreement and a provider manual. If you're out of network, you're having to navigate the payer's online resources to keeping up to date with their provider standards. So it's a little bit more of a hunt and peck game as far as the direction goes on your relationship status of working with the payer. And then finally, the contract. So I kind of tapped into this just a second here with the guidelines for an individual provider that you're in network with. And these are groups that are based on negotiations. So because a contract can be different negotiations based off of entities or by states or times in which you make the negotiation, these guidelines are typically provided within your contract. So providers will get outlines as far as what is compliant billing claim standards, what are medical necessities, what are all those guidelines as a provider you need to maintain. However, regardless of the funding source, following billing compliance is the most important part of ensuring that you as a provider are being treated fairly and rendering services according to all of the agreed upon terms based on your contracts. Not billing within the compliance statuses, these results could create audits, they could create loss or delays in revenue, they could cause severe cases in contracting issues where your contract is no longer allowed to continue due to non-compliant billing practices. Kind of looking at the resources that you're using based off of that survey, I think I saw kind of an equal blend between the contracts, the manuals, but sometimes it still feels like you come to yourself, you read these information pieces and you think to yourself, what are these payers thinking? Insurance is not designed to make it easy. So let's view this from the other side and kind of tie that into some of the resources that you guys are providing your reassurance on how you're operating. So it's a fact that it often feels like for me that payers are in it to make it difficult. They're not in it for me as a provider to pay services. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of audience members who also feel the same way. You just feel like you could bash your head against a wall and never get answers that make any kind of logical sense. However, there is reason to the process. And if we can learn how to navigate through these intricacies, you kind of find the magic recipe that makes everything kind of fall into line. So regardless of the treatment plan that was set in, medical necessity, authorizations on files, how we submitted claims, there's often the commonality where we get the runaround from payers that doesn't align with how we understood the care that was necessary for our client. So first and foremost, separating what we feel is needed for the client with compliancy really can't be too much cross-shared as far as logical thinking goes. If we can separate the two, the next couple things I share with you might make a little bit more sense. And we know that not every payer treats us in the favorable piece of helping us continue our businesses. They're not in it for the longevity of making us receive money, make a profit. They're in it to reduce outgoing payments. Think about it this way. ABA services are a long-term therapy. They're not just take this medication for a week and now you're cured of the flu this month. What it is it's kind of seen to by the insurances as a long-term expense. So they're paying a lot of money month over month, year over year for services that are fairly still new to the medical industry. I know that when we first started, payers didn't consider ABA medical necessity at all. And for some of you guys on this call, you remember those times. And it wasn't covered by many plans either. So each payer did really what they wanted. And a lot of the time you couldn't get anyone on the phone or even understand the services that had kind of permanency to policies or regulations. But that's changed. In the last several years, most of these organizations or these payers have started resorting to permanent codes, permanent practices, better guidelines. And all they still tend to do what they want, or at least it feels that way sometimes, they have dictated terms in a more grander scale that allows payers to really help us identify ongoing issues. There are better resources with provider representatives at the payer level that might let us know a little bit more about what's going on or how to really navigate the complexities of billing with a payer. So although the information's not 100% and it may not always be correct, the resources are growing year after year. So let's talk about empowering your organization. Some of you guys on that survey said, we phone a friend. So one of the things that I want to kind of time here for just a second is let's look at how we can maximize our resources, not just using the provider manuals, not just using our contracts, not just using coding books, but really diversifying our ways that we're getting information to identify how to really make sure we know every detail of working with a payer. So looking at the denial is going to be kind of a first suggested place to start your case. Ask yourself, do we follow correct billing practices? Do we know what the requirements are? Do I have evidence to support to the payer? And do I have what I need to know why it was denied? So if we take these questions, kind of like your who, what, where's at the beginning of the presentation, Megan, and look at this like I'm going to court, you can start plugging in some of the critical pieces or the knowledge that you need to be able to support what's going on with your payer and not getting the runaround from a representative or finding false information you're hearing from a friend or what this organization does compared to yours. Because remember, we talked about earlier, these may be state specific to you. These may be contract specific to your organization. So not all information is cross-shared. So if we hopefully kind of talk about some of these topics here and ways to enhance this, we're hoping that you're kind of getting some ammunition to really fine tune your own institution specific practices. So Megan, we've seen these payers send us some rather particular denials. I know we've both seen some fun ones that we've chased around, but can you chat with the group for a moment on how, if the denial really did need documentation, how does this something that we should look at more closely help us in compliancy?
Yes, you're definitely correct there. We've seen some really peculiar denials that just have you scratching your head, but we've also seen some valid ones when they are actually asking for records that are needed. Again, I'm not a clinician, but I've seen the documentation put together for these services, and I've been part of the process that is extremely time consuming, especially when this imperative piece of treatment is not reimbursed. It is underappreciated, in my opinion, the time and care that it goes into these treatment plans and these session notes. Payers currently don't understand that, and we all know at an organizational level, the non-face-to-face time is not reimbursed. So it's an important piece of compliant billing, yet it's not reimbursable. So how can we make sure that you are using everything at your advantage to make sure that you are spending time with your clients, that you're getting the right documentation, following compliant billing, but also running a business? The number one piece we like to go over is having a software tool that could assist you with this process. It's important because it can help save time that for your providers is better spent with the client and their family. Within that software, you want to make sure that you have templates to make sure that all of your providers are giving the same information. If you have the same information, it helps maintain best practices as well as ensuring your documentation is following the billing and compliance guidelines. A platform tool like CentralReach can support you with something like this and creating templates for sessions that ensure you capture these requirements based on the individual pieces of your payer contracts. Knowledge. We've talked about it multiple times. Knowledge is power. Having a team that understands how to read the tools provided by the payers to ensure these regulations are being followed helps maintain your billing compliance and helps to support the team needs with follow-up to make sure that these are kept up to date while things changes. That's one of the great things about Sierra Bill Max. We pay attention to these different types of things. We see what's coming down the pipelines. Like Ashley said, we know that there's certain guidelines and changes that TRICARE puts out their bulletins every couple of months, that United Healthcare does it. So knowledge is power. Get that information out, understand it, know your payer trends and tracking when they give that information. Most commercial payers, they're only giving you that information as needed or when you're asking for it. They might be as limited, but they do put out those provider bulletins that go to your mailbox. And a lot of times you just shove it along. This doesn't pertain to me, but take a deeper look. A lot of the times you might have little snippets of things that are changing or upcoming pieces that you could pay attention to. And lastly, training. Train your teams. Payers change. State and federal guidelines change. Most of the time, they're becoming more strict. They're not going to be more lenient with their requirements. So you might have had a broader range of stuff that you put into your documentation, but now you need to become more strict. Having someone that can train your providers and your team members on those changes and work with them on adapting workflows to adjust these changes helps ensure that your billing compliance is held up no matter what happens with the guidelines. Right, Ashley? That's all what it's about, is making sure that we're maintaining everything that needs to be there.
Absolutely. And at this stage, I think it's really interesting to be talking about this point because we know that there are constant reevaluations of the state and the federal payer guidelines that are happening right now. Taking a look at, recent environmental things that went through and policy pieces, there's definitely room to understand that the payer guidelines devise internal resources in order for us to reference. So they make sure that there is some set of information that we can follow to fall back on those materials. But like you said, really, it's not a matter of just dismissing it, but identifying it, internalizing how it impacts, and then providing a resource internally for the staff. Because if we're all just holding information in our heads, it's really not doing anybody a service. So let's think about, based on your organization's support structure and your staff, do you have a resource that can be companioned with a way to look at the data that you're billing? Do you have information within CR for quality assurance that allows you to report back where there could be potential compliant risks? Are you using tools such as ABI reports or internal billing guides? Do you understand if the departments have healthy workflows? Starting by just really understanding what the resources are for the team can help move you into the next stage here, which is who is ensuring the quality? Do spot audits. You should have some audit or form of integrity of looking at your records to ensure that in the event that if you have an audit, you're ready and in doing compliant practices will really help you kind of make sure that you're getting into an audit and out as quickly as possible. But it's okay to check your team's work. And remember that an audit should be less than 10% of what's actually being billed. Looking at every claim is not an audit. Looking at every medical record is not an audit, but using quality time to really identify what the team is doing for that quality reassurance helps you through multitasking and getting through all of the other things that you're trying to do to make sure you're compliantly hitting these targets. So follow those resource documents and check. More sound practices mean more stability with your business. So when we're looking at, are we doing what the payers require? More and more payers, like you've mentioned, Megan, are cracking down. I know that there's been talks and more visible noticing of payers really identifying utilization when you reauthorize, or that medical necessity. What does it mean? Are we still supposed to be billing these services? So you at the organization level may have started seeing these trends as well. But what this means is you need to really be ready to support at any time your practices that you have in place up to the standards that you know of the payer. So that taking the time to really ensure that your services needed are providing that impact on that client are just a few things you can do to really be ready for those moments where the payers are going to ask you, are you following our guidelines? It also adds a nice little level of complexity when there's no auth required, because it even means that you may be asked to be scrutinized a little bit closer on medical necessity. So if you remember from the earlier slide, payers are not in it to make you money. Keep that in mind as you're putting some of these workflows in place and asking yourself, are we providing a service to our organization and our clients to continue our strong business going forward? All right, so let's talk a little bit about CentralReach and BillMax and how these two things play a role. So I'll speak to the CR side of things. You might have heard me use some key words like session note templates and ABI reporting. They're just a few of the tools that the platform offers for you. So custom standard reporting tools, you have options, and you should know how to really use your practice management tool to maintain all of the other operational pieces for billing compliance. And if you're asking yourself, I don't know if we are using all the tools, we should be really resourcing our CSL, our client success lead, to identify if there's anything new maybe you don't know about. Is the software really maximizing your business and what's needed to adjust if we want to change what we're currently doing to make things easier or to provide more tighter compliance? As the need of the customer changes, so does the software. So this should be a question you ask yourself rather regularly. Megan, do you mind chiming in on BillMax and what we can add here?
Sure. So you ask yourself, why Bill Max? During our implementation process, we make sure that these types of workflows are set up for success. And during your year-end processes, your Bill Max CSL will partner with you to make sure that reminders are set and you are set up for success at the start of every year that you're working with Bill Max. We support what the data shows. We help configure ways to use the system effectively and to structure that for your specific organization. We also help inform you of payer changes when we see trends or announcements released by payers. Belmax is a partner in the process, and we do what we can to look out for the customer as your success is our success. So like we said, those payers are constantly making changes. You might not have gotten the communication, but we might have seen it somewhere else. We're going to effectively make sure that you're on top of those communications, and we're helping you make those changes before it directly impacts your revenue.
Absolutely. So just a couple of more resources to tie in as we close out this webinar here. A couple key things to let you all know as a group is we have those resources. CentralReach is here for you. We do have CR Unite coming up here. So just kind of talking about this for just a second. This is a presentation. If you take a scan here of that QR code, the QR code is going to direct you to the homepage for more details on speakers, the agenda, more details on sessions, kind of like the general billing topics you see here, and all of the great things that can help you become more resourceful with your organization and your sessions of running your business. We welcome you to join us at this year's CentralReach conference at CR Unites and the Autism and IDD Care Conference. We're hosting it in New Orleans this year on October for 3 days of training, networking, and continuing education. So you mentioned earlier on that survey, another opportunity to get plenty of exposure and time to relax, have fun, and connect with colleagues and peers. So please feel free to take the information down. We hope to see you at CR Unites. If you can hang back and take a quick survey as well, maybe a minute of your time longer, we really appreciate any feedback that allows us to really grow these webinars to benefit our customers on the listening end here. And we thank everyone for your time and your attention this afternoon. We hope to see you on future webinars.